Well, after the Enlightenment in Europe, Christianity rapidly declined in favor of what would be called secularism. Secularism as a whole leans towards science and what is provable. If it cannot be proved, it cannot be followed. It is said that any belief in a god or a spiritual realm would be like believing in fairy tales. Children believe in fairy tales, and we are not children, so the reasoning went. The conclusion was drawn that any society or culture that accepted such superstitions was simply not yet well enough educated to know better. If we spend any time in a college setting, we've heard this sort of ideology, a little bit at least. The leaders of the Enlightenment, like Karl Marx, postulated that the place of religion in an educated culture would simply fade away. In the land of colleges and universities, we would see the end of spiritual nonsense. As these ideals arose, much of Europe became secular nations. The once center of Christianity is in many places almost devoid of it. Christianity is not gone in Europe, but it is greatly, greatly diminished. Whether we like to admit it or not, the U.S., well, we tend to follow the same trends of Europe only a few years later. We aren't the trendsetters we like to think we are. We are just followers that aren't quite up to the times. In the last 20 years or so, we have seen the same thing happen to some extent in our culture. The church as a whole has either been shrinking or standing pat, at least in the U.S. I want to stress that in the U.S. This isn't happening elsewhere in the world, just here. It's not been growing as one would hope. It's not been multiplying. More than anything, though, the church has been greatly losing influence in the public realm. Access to schools, many social services, and even in politics, the church has greatly diminished. A doctrine of separation of church and state that's always been there has been emphasized more and more and more. That restricts many of the places and ways in which the church once worked. Many would say that the church is dying. Okay, we've heard that before too, haven't we? But if we look at the worldwide numbers, that's not happening. But when we look at the U.S., that's not quite so clear. I'd argue that in the church, that the church in the U.S. is not dying. In fact, in some places I would say that it is growing. But one thing that I can say for sure is that the church's position of influence and power is drastically changing. The way the church operates is changing greatly. For many years, the church had a position of great power in the U.S. Organizations like the Moral Majority and Family, Focus on the Family, and things like that. It controlled much in politics and influenced greatly the way in which our culture and our society organized itself. There were very clearly laws on the books that were undoubtedly driven by Christian doctrine. There were blue laws regarding businesses opening on Sundays. Obviously, those aren't in place anymore. I mean, I do understand there are some places that those are actually still in place. I know there was one in not a blue law, but it's kind of a comical one in Pontiac, Michigan. There is a law that obviously is not enforced because I'm not sure how you would ever enforce this. There is a law that a man and a woman are not allowed to shower together. How do you enforce that? And what would happen? And can you imagine someone ever actually being brought to court on those charges? Probably not. Then there is, of course, our nation's bouts with prohibition. It could be argued in the modern age, the last 200 years or so, that the United States has seen Christianity's greatest point of influence and power. What is the church now to do in the face of diminishing power and influence? Well, I would challenge that a lessening of political influence for the church is not a bad thing. Because I'm not sure that the church was ever meant or created to wield power and influence in the regards that we value power and influence. It was never meant to stand above anyone or anything. Look at the gospel of Christ. The church has been given an authority, though, to seek justice. It should use this authority to serve and to love community, as it says in Isaiah 1:17. Right? Isaiah 1:17. Hey! Learn to do good. Seek justice. Correct oppression. Bring justice to the fatherless. Plead the widow's cause. How can we seek justice if no one will listen to us? If we no longer have a place of influence? Many feel that the only answer is to seek to regain the power and influence that the church once had. We must restore the glory days. I remember what this church used to be, and we want that back. But to seek the glory days is to deny that our culture, or even the church itself, has experienced any change whatsoever. And if it is to identify and say, yes, we have changed, to say that there has been no good change at all in our congregation, in any church congregation, in the last 50 years. We can't seek what was once. It's never a good thing to try to regain what we once had. To do that would be stuck in the past. On top of that, I don't see anywhere in Scripture where it says the church needs a position of power in order to bring about justice faithfully. Jesus didn't have a position of power and authority. Yet what did he do? In fact, it says of Jesus in Isaiah 42:3, a bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. So Jesus is going to be so gentle with this that he's not going to break a bruised reed or extinguish a faintly lit candle, yet justice will be accomplished. I don't know what your definition of power is, but that doesn't sound like power to me. Jesus, and by extension his church, were prophesied to bring forth justice without the use of, or even the need of, a big stick. We don't need a big stick to go out into all the world, to preach the gospel, to change the world. A Christian doesn't need to be the biggest fish in the sea to make a difference. Remember Jesus said the last will be first and the first will be last? Jesus said to his disciples, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but came to serve. If you want to be the greatest, you must become a servant of all. That doesn't sound like the way the church has operated over the last 50 years. So maybe this is a blessing. When the church has been the most effective and performed most faithfully the task of seeking justice and faithfully using the authority that was given to it, it's always been when the church has been at its weakest. At what time in history did the church experience the greatest period of growth and success? Certainly wasn't the 20th century in the U.S. Now, I might challenge that the church might just be seeing its greatest period of success right now. It's just not happening here. But think about the original 12 apostles, what they were called to do, and how they did it. They shared the good news with all the world. It was when the church had zero power and zero influence, and when it was in fact being pursued and persecuted, when it had what could be called its greatest moments. The places in the world where the church is currently enjoying the most success and experiencing the greatest growth is in the places it has no power and where people need justice the most. Places like China, Saudi Arabia, and India are where we see the church functioning in such a great manner. The church was designed to operate best when it functioned out of a place of weakness. I think I remember God saying something like that to Paul, right? My strength is made perfect in weakness. We have to realize don't need to look on the diminishing influence of the church and power of the church with fear. In fact, maybe we should look on it with opportunity. Maybe we should, in fact, celebrate it. Maybe we should realize that something's coming, because it's always been when the church has been able to work from a place of weakness that it's done us the greatest good. I think the church's problem in the last 100 years or so has been, it's been a victim of its own success. Humanity doesn't know what to do with power. Just because the voice of the church has been turned down doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at all. Sometimes it's like the TV. When you turn the volume up too high, you can't understand anything that's being said. We as the church need to learn how to function from a position of weakness. Or to put it another way, humility. I think that's something that's also lost with power and influence, humility. As difficult as this might seem, we need to remember something. The first century church operated very effectively without any place of power in society, and they were always the minority. We can know that no matter where we stand, whether looked up to or looked down upon, that we have a Savior who is stronger than any of us, and He is working. Before He left His disciples alone in the world, you know what He did? Well, He had something to tell them. He said there would be persecution, there would be separation, they would be weak and they would be pursued, they would be looked down upon and they would be ignored. They would feel like failures, as if they had been overcome. But then in John 16:33, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So many times we are told to defend the cross, defend the faith, or defend God's holiness. We need to stand up for God. Right? The song, stand up for Jesus. I really don't like that song. If God is bigger than anything else in the world, then He doesn't need us to defend Him. God laid out the gospel in such a way that it will stand. Justice will come forth. God doesn't desire our sword against an unbelieving and blasphemous world. He desires our obedience to His methods and His callings. He doesn't say, tear down and destroy the enemy. He says, become the least of all, the servant of all. In other words, don't destroy your enemy, serve your enemy. That's a lot less fun. We don't need to overcome, because Jesus says He already has. As Jesus went to the cross in a position of greatest weakness, He did not lose, but rather He overcame. The path to true power and influence is through weakness and humility. As we hear the world tell us that the church is diminishing, we need to realize that it is really only gaining true power instead of this fake political power that the world values. Jesus has overcome, and therefore we are free to take heart and work. So how do we practice the authority of the church, given to us by God, without standing in a position of power? Well, let me read something for you. A portion of a letter written by someone in the early church. This is from about the 3rd century BC, when the church did not have a position of power. It's simply known as the letter to Diognetus. And mind you, this is written from someone talking about the church, talking about Christianity, when they were the minority, when many places did not even have a church building to meet in, and they were weak and persecuted. It says, Christians cannot be distinguished from the rest of the human race by country or language or customs. They do not live in cities of their own. They do not use a peculiar form of speech. They do not follow an eccentric manner of life. Every foreign land is their fatherland, and yet every foreign fatherland is a foreign land. They marry like everyone else, and they beget children, but they do not cast off their offspring. They share their board with each other, but not their marriage bed. It is true that they are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They busy themselves on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws, but in their own lives, they go far beyond what the law requires. To put it simply, what the soul is to the body, that Christians are in the world. Repeat that. What the soul is to the body, that Christians are to the world. The soul is dispersed through all the members of the body, and Christians are scattered through all the cities of the world. The soul dwells in the body, but does not belong to the body. And the Christians dwell in the world, but do not belong to the world. I actually love that analogy. Church being the soul of the world. We are meant to guide and guard it, to warn and to love it, but not to control it. Notice how this letter describes the church being authoritative. The church exhibits the authority of God by doing what? By serving and practicing righteousness. Or if we want to think of our calling as to seek justice, by serving and practicing justice. It guides the world by first and foremost being an example to it. How do we correct oppression? Starting right here, right? Scott and I were talking a little bit after class. Do not complain about anything you are not willing to be the solution to. That is childish. There's no way around it. It is childish. God has sent the world out to do something about justice, to do something about oppression. We can't say that is wrong unless we're willing to do something about it. Being willing to be the first changed. The reason the church was heard and was listened to was because it went above and beyond what the law required of it. It didn't do simply the minimum to get by. Do you know there came a time when Christianity was illegal? Right? We've heard this. The church was persecuted, so on and so forth, right? Okay. But what you may not know is that in many cities, it was illegal to be Christian. The people in the city knew there were Christians in the city. They knew who they were, and they knew where they lived. But they did nothing about it, and they didn't report it. Do you know why? Because these Christians were desirable people to the city. They were good, law-abiding citizens that were good for the city. There was legal persecution on the books that said, the law says you cannot do this. And whole cities said, well, we're not going to bother them even though it's legal because they are good for us. What would happen if our city, if our country felt that about the church? Yeah, we don't agree with them. Yeah, we think this isn't right. Yeah, we think they shouldn't be allowed to do this. But you know what? We're going to ignore it because we think the church is good for us. Does our culture, does our society, does our community believe that we are good for them? Unfortunately, many of the power grabs that we've seen by the church in the past, in order to get a voice, have been a basic denial of what Paul told us in Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. When we seek the world's power, we become conformed to the world and just like it. There is a higher power, and that is Jesus. Jesus has overcome, and he will continue to overcome. through His church. We don't need to fear diminishing influence or even numbers. The world may go whichever way it chooses, but we will stay the course, and we will continue to build and continue to guide. We will continue to be good for it. We will function as servants of God, seeking the world and each other. Serving the world and each other. We will seek justice by ourselves doing justice. We won't petition someone else to feed the poor, but rather we ourselves will be the help that they need. We will nudge the world when it strays and call it back without ourselves becoming the world. As the hands and feet of God, we must learn to function as the soul of the world, bringing to it salvation and victory, while at the same time not becoming coercive or domineering. Our God is great, and He has overcome. He will overcome again. We have nothing to fear.